Dogs find a grandmother and her grandson trapped in a cactus, and the reason left everyone astonished. That day, May 17, 2021, the Sonoran Desert awakened with an almost strange silence, as if the wind feared disturbing some buried secret. Suddenly, a muffled moan broke the stillness. Two dogs with dusty fur and alert eyes stopped dead in their tracks. Max, with his left ear always drooping, raised his head toward some rock formations, while Luna, smaller and with light fur, sniffed the air, insistently. It was as if they had caught a scent that mixed pain and fear. The first rays of sun were already beating harshly on the Sonoran Desert National Park, famous for its giant cacti, the saguaros that rise like guardians of the desert. That morning, however, something peculiar was happening next to one of these. Immense green sentinels. Max and Luna advanced cautiously, taking careful steps over the hot stones until they spotted two human silhouettes trapped against the thorny trunk of a saguaro. It was an elderly woman with white hair and a boy of barely 9 years old. Both were tied with thick ropes, their clothes torn and their faces bathed in sweat. The moans they had heard came from the trembling lips of the elderly woman. "Help!" she whispered desperately. The boy beside her seemed about to faint. He had scratches on his cheeks and a trickle of blood ran down his forearm. His large brown eyes opened when he saw the two dogs approaching. Something inside him sensed that those animals were not a threat. Instead, they could mean his salvation. Max wagged his tail cautiously. He seemed to know the situation was delicate. Luna beside him tilted her head and let out a short whine of empathy. Never before had they seen people in such misfortune, trapped by the sharp arms of a saguaro. For the elderly woman, every movement was torture, as the thorns embedded deeper into her skin. The boy tried to adjust so his grandmother wouldn't be so hurt, but his own bindings prevented him from moving freely. Max, with his more robust bearing, began sniffing the rope that surrounded the woman's frail body. The elderly woman raised, her gaze with a glimmer of hope. The dogs were attentive, trying to find a way to free them. Luna's bark resonated for an instant, bouncing among the rocks. There was shared urgency in that bark, as if saying, "We need to hurry." The woman named Grace Miller breathed with effort. She didn't understand how she had gotten there or why her grandson and she were in that pitiful state. She knew her name, remembered pieces of her life, but there was a blurry gap that prevented her from reconstructing the last few hours. Oliver, the boy, had his mind full of confusion. He remembered having left with his grandmother that morning from Tucson with the intention of visiting a specific point in the park, perhaps for a picnic or some special outing. But afterward his memory became blurred. The next thing he knew was that he woke up tied with his grandmother beside him, feeling total helplessness. "Grandma," the boy murmured, resisting the stabs of pain. "Who did this?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Grace responded in a whisper. The feeling of vulnerability intensified with each minute. The sun was relentless, and there was real danger of rapid dehydration. The elderly woman, protecting Oliver with her free arm, looked at the dogs with gratitude, silently praying they would find a way to free them. Max, with determination, sunk his teeth into the edges of the rope. The harsh scraping of the rope against the dog's incisors could be heard while Luna accompanied him, pulling with her snout. After several attempts that seemed futile, they managed to tear part of the fibers. Oliver, feeling the rope loosen a bit, pushed himself to free his torso, but a stab of pain ran through his back. Even so, the animal's help didn't stop. With joint work, bites and pulls, the ropes gradually became threads, finally giving way. "They're loosening," Oliver let out with an excited gasp. Finally, with a last stroke of luck, Max tore the thickest part of the rope that held Grace. She let herself fall forward with a muffled cry as she felt several thorns embedding even deeper into her forearm. Oliver also freed himself, but not without hurting his calf against a series of spikes. Blood began to flow. They stood up, staggering. Grace hugged the boy tightly, ignoring the burning of her own wounds. "My God, what is happening?" Grace muttered, feeling her mouth dry and her brain confused. She didn't remember the exact moment when someone ambushed them. Oliver wiped his face with the back of his hand. His eyes were a whirlwind of fear. He observed the endless desert, with no trace of vehicle or person. Only the two dogs seemed to inhabit that hostile landscape alongside them. "Grandma, I'm thirsty," the boy said with a trembling voice. Grace pressed her lips. The desert stretched around them with its scorching mantle. Not a canteen or water bottle in sight. Under their feet the ground burned. The cacti in their stillness seemed to keep a complicit silence, as if they knew more than they appeared. "Calm down, my love," she sighed. "We'll find a way." Max barked, to get their attention, as if wanting to indicate a path. He moved his head, pointing northwest where a rocky trail could be seen. Luna also moved in that direction, waiting for them to follow. Grace leaned on Oliver, and together they began walking with hesitant steps. Neither of them understood the situation, but they knew survival depended on moving forward. The air shimmered from the heat. Each step reminded them of the limits of the human body in such a merciless place. From time to time, Grace stopped to breathe and evaluated Oliver, who endured the pain in his calf. The dogs, more accustomed to hardships, stayed alert, exploring possible sources of shade or water. "Do you think someone is looking for us?" Oliver asked after a few minutes, fighting against uncertainty. Grace observed the horizon, remembering that her life had always been tinted by secrets. Part of her prayed that by some miracle the police were already on the case. The other part feared that those responsible were lurking. "I hope so, sweetheart. Let's not stop," she responded, forcing a smile. As they advanced, the elderly woman felt a shudder that didn't come from the heat. A dark premonition nested in her chest. There was something in the atmosphere that reminded her of past times, and she feared that her damned past had finally caught up with her. Oliver, noticing his grandmother's worry, wanted to ask, but preferred to stay quiet and save strength. Suddenly, the boy stumbled over a stone. He fell to his knees, biting his lower lip to keep from screaming from the pain. Max hurried to sniff him, as if knowing that every minute counted. Luna stayed a bit behind, looking with a glimmer of concern in her dark eyes. It was then that Grace remembered the words of an old friend. "In the desert, every decision is a matter of life or death." And that phrase weighed heavily on her mind. Grace's exhausted head wandered in a flash of memory. Hot blood rushed to her cheeks. She remembered the day she became a key witness to a crime. Back then she was called Grace Henderson, not Miller. They had taken her into a witness protection program after she denounced a group of traffickers operating on the border. The memory pressed against her chest. The idea that all of that would come back to her seemed unbearable. Finally, she dismissed those thoughts. She needed to take care of Oliver and stay on her feet. Nevertheless, the memories crowded in. She remembered one face in particular, a man with cold eyes and a scar on his right cheek. He always seemed terrifying to her. Could it be possible that he would see her again? A chill ran through her body. There was no proof that he was behind everything, but the shadow of that suspicion became clearer and clearer. They continued walking. The hours passed slowly. The sun was already descending, tinting the rocks and cacti with a burning orange tone. Max and Luna found a small thicket where they could take shelter. In that clearing, Oliver and Grace sat down with a sigh of relief. They were dying of thirst. Their throats tightened. Not even a salty puddle appeared in sight. Oliver squeezed his grandmother's hand. "I don't remember anything after getting in the car, Grandma, do you?" His eyes reflected the hope that she would have an answer. Grace shook her head, swallowing saliva. "The same thing happens to me, sweetheart. I only have diffuse fragments, but I swear we'll get out of this." Max raised his head, catching some noise in the distance. A slight vibration resonated in the ground. A motor, perhaps a car, traveling on a secondary road. It was almost impossible to know with precision, but the simple idea of human contact could mean salvation or danger. Exhausted, Grace leaned her back against a rock and closed her eyes for a second. She couldn't help it. Her mind took her to a remote time. She saw herself younger, arguing with federal agents in an improvised barracks. She told them what she had seen: a brutal murder at night, contraband substances, and a man who had threatened her with death. After the testimony, she had to flee and change her identity, trusting in the protection program. And even so, after years, her daughter died in a dubious accident. Since then, She lived with a silent fear that her past would return, making her pay the highest price, Oliver's safety. She opened her eyes, agitated. The sun was almost setting. Oliver was trying to sleep, leaning on Max. Luna beside him was carefully licking a scratch the boy had on his ankle, trying to relieve his pain. Grace dried a tear. She couldn't allow herself to weaken, but uncertainty was eating away at her. How is it possible that they had appeared tied to a cactus without remembering anything? Had someone drugged them or hit them? With night came an unexpected cold. The desert can be deceptive. The scorching heat of day gives way to an icy wind. That chills to the bone. Grace sought shelter behind a rock formation that offered some protection against the wind. Oliver shivered, his fingers trembling as he hugged Luna. Max remained on guard, ears attentive. A distant howl broke the nocturnal silence. Could it be a coyote? "Grandma, I'm scared," Oliver confessed, closing his eyes. "I know, my life," she responded softly, caressing his hair. Her heart was oppressed, but she strove to transmit courage. The night advanced very slowly. The moon rose, outlining the silhouettes of rocks and cacti. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every sound could mean the arrival of those who had kidnapped them. Grace didn't sleep a wink. She felt her heartbeats were a drum resonating in the darkness. From time to time, she cast glances at Max and Luna, grateful to have them near. The first ray of sun was received with a sigh of relief and concern. Both Grace and Oliver stood up sore. The wounds remained open and thirst became unbearable. Even so, they began walking with slow steps, avoiding stepping on thorny bushes. After a while, they distinguished in the distance what seemed to be a dusty road, a grayish line that might take them back to civilization. Oliver felt a glimmer of hope. With his hand on his forehead to protect himself from the sun, he spotted something moving on the road. It looked like a vehicle approaching. He smiled with tears in his eyes. "Do you think they'll come to help us?" he asked with some emotion. Grace, with her brow furrowed, wasn't so sure. She noticed that the vehicle's paint was black, shiny, and it moved with erratic speed. A premonition of danger shook her soul. "We'd better hide behind those bushes. I don't know if it's safe," she ordered with a tense voice. Max and Luna nodded with their canine gestures, following the elderly woman and the boy toward a depression in the terrain. They hid, hoping the vehicle would pass by, but it didn't. It stopped right on the edge, and the slam of someone getting out was heard. Voices resonated in the air, masculine and hoarse, mentioning the name Grace Henderson. Instinctively, she held her breath. Those voices seemed familiar to her, although several decades had passed. Grace's heart beat furiously. She lay down in the sand, praying they wouldn't see her. Oliver looked at her confused, but didn't dare say a word. Max crouched, ready to protect him if necessary. Luna lay against the boy, trying to cover him as best she could. "Are you sure you heard something?" growled one of the men, opening the back door of the truck. "Yes, I tell you they were seen around here. An older woman and a boy with a couple of dirty dogs. They can't have gone very far," another responded. The words were charged with hostility. Grace put her hand to her chest. What she feared most had become reality. The men she had denounced in the past were looking for her to exact revenge. When the footsteps moved away a few meters, Grace took advantage to move. She made a silent sign to Oliver and the dogs, indicating they should flee on the opposite side. With utmost care, they began crawling on the ground, feeling on their skin the harshness of gravel and small stones that dug into their palms. Oliver stifled a whimper, but continued. When they felt safe, they stood up behind some larger rocks. Oliver looked at his grandmother with tears in his eyes. "Why do they know your name? Why do they call you Henderson? You've always told me our last name is Miller. Grandma, what have you hidden from me?" Grace hesitated, feeling a knot in her throat. The moment had come to face the truth, even if it was in the worst way. "I can't talk about this here, sweetheart, but soon you'll know. Just trust me." The boy clenched his fists. His eyes reflected not only fear but also pain. He understood that his grandmother had lied to him, and he couldn't bear the betrayal even though he loved her deeply. That revelation filled him with anguish. Max approached him and licked his hand, trying to console him. The wind lifted a handful of dust, covering the scene with a veil of desolation. They continued advancing in the opposite direction from the truck. The heat was again suffocating. Fortunately, they found a small, natural watering hole, probably formed after a scarce rain from days before. The water was murky, but better that than dying of thirst. Grace leaned down and drank cautiously, offering some to Oliver. Max and Luna approached to quench their thirst with their tongues hanging out and panting with each sip. The liquid had a metallic taste, but at least it calmed the burning in their throats. With renewed energy, they decided to rest for a few minutes. It was then that in the midst of the stillness, Grace broke the silence. "Oliver, forgive me. I know this is very confusing, but there are matters from my past that I couldn't tell you about. I did it to protect you." The boy looked at her with a furrowed brow, his hands stained with dirt and dried blood. "You always told me about the importance of honesty. Why lie to me?" Grace closed her eyes for an instant, feeling a weight on her shoulders. She thought about her daughter's death, Oliver's mother, and how that event marked her. "I feared that if you knew the truth, you would be in more danger. I've changed my name, house, job, everything so they wouldn't find us. I did the right thing by denouncing very powerful people, but now they're after me, after us." Oliver lowered his gaze. He felt a muted rage, but also a glimpse of understanding. Max curled up next to them while Luna kept her ears up, alert to any sound. The tension was palpable, the rest was brief. Too brief. Before they could regain strength, a muffled buzzing, almost distant, burst into the dry and silent air. Oliver tensed. His brown eyes opened enormously, fixed on the horizon. Grace felt a chill that crossed every fiber of her fragile body. That black truck, sinister and dusty, advanced staggering along the route, zigzagging, showing the desperation of those inside. The elderly woman took a sharp breath. She looked urgently at Oliver, who, paralyzed by fear, barely breathed. Max and Luna immediately raised their ears, their bodies tense like springs. The dogs, already aware of the approaching danger, growled, softly alert. A mistake, a doubt, a minimal hesitation would mean the end. "We have to move now, Oliver," Grace whispered with a voice broken by anguish, standing up with difficulty. The motor roared louder. The vehicle accelerated, raising behind it a thick curtain of yellow dust. Oliver could distinguish through the desert's undulating heat the threatening silhouette of a man who leaned half his body out the window, his extended arm holding something bright, a silver flash that made his heart beat frantically. It was a pistol. The certainty hit the boy with a crudeness he had never felt. "Hide quickly," Grace ordered, grabbing the little one's arm with almost painful force, running clumsily towards some rocks that seemed to have been thrown there by some furious giant. Each step was agony. The sharp stones scratched their ankles. As they moved as fast as possible, Max ran beside them with clenched teeth, vigilant and protective. Luna advanced a bit behind, constantly turning her head, as if measuring the distance separating her from the imminent danger. In seconds, they reached the temporary shelter of the large rocks, crouching and trying to make themselves invisible. Grace's agitated breathing resonated alongside Oliver's contained panting. But it was too late. A dry and terrifying crash thundered in the air. A gunshot cut the stillness, tearing the silence with brutality. The echo of the detonation reverberated among the rocks, amplifying Oliver's terror, who closed his eyes instinctively. His mind imagined the bullet whistling near them. He felt it could reach him at any moment, pierce his fragile body and end everything. Grace remained motionless for an instant, her hand over her chest, trying to calm the stabbing pain of her accelerated heart. Her green eyes, open like never before, reflected all the desperation of someone who feels trapped by fatality. It was then that a defiant and powerful bark pulled her from that mortal trance. Max had come out from behind the rock. The imposing German shepherd planted himself firmly on his front paws, his black and brown hair completely bristled, his threatening fangs exposed. He would not retreat, not even before death. Luna beside him let out another bark, sharper and more worried. Both dogs, aware that their human friends' lives hung by a thread, prepared for whatever might come. The truck braked abruptly, skidding on the sandy terrain, stopping just a few meters from their improvised hiding place. Dust enveloped the vehicle like a ghostly cloud, creating a nightmare image. Oliver felt the ground under his feet vibrate, not only from the braking, but from the fear that dominated him. Absolute panic had taken possession of him, feeling it was impossible to escape. "Get the old woman!" shouted a hoarse and harsh voice charged with hatred. Grace shuddered upon hearing that merciless order. Her entire body tensed, her hands trembled, uncontrollably. She knew her past had finally found her, that the ghosts of her decisions pursued her without mercy. She looked at little Oliver, whose face covered with sweat and dirt showed a mixture of horror and confusion. She had to protect him at all costs, even if it meant directly facing those demons from the past. Oliver observed his grandmother's eyes, seeing in them the gleam of fierce determination. Grace breathed deeply, knowing this could be her last chance. With a voice stronger than she felt capable of, she whispered in the boy's ear, "Run when I tell you, don't look back. Promise me, Oliver." The boy shook his head frantically, unable to accept that idea. "I can't leave you, Grandma," he said, with tears beginning to fall. Grace held his face with desperate tenderness, her voice broken by emotion and urgency. "Listen to me, Oliver. No matter what happens to me, you have to live, you have to run. Do you hear me?" Max and Luna barked again, warning that the men were already getting out of the truck, approaching with firm and determined steps. Oliver closed his eyes tightly, feeling anguish pressing his chest. His heart beat so hard he could barely hear anything else. The seconds were eternal. Time seemed suspended at an unbearable point between fear and courage. Grace, with her soul on the edge of the abyss, took a breath and slightly peeked her head out. She saw them clearly. Two intimidating figures walking in a straight line toward them. One of them was taller, muscular, covered in tattoos. The other wore a dark hat that partially hid his face, a cold and merciless silhouette that seemed to emerge from a nightmare. In that instant, she knew the fight for her life and her grandson's had begun. She knew this would be the definitive confrontation with a past that had never stopped stalking her. Her lips pressed together firmly, and although physical strength barely remained, her spirit rose defiantly before the approaching threat. "Get ready, Oliver," she murmured with a firm voice, though her hands trembled. "This isn't over yet." While speaking, Grace felt within her the growing certainty that although death might be near, she wouldn't surrender easily, because what was at stake wasn't just her life, but also Oliver's and their shared future. The elderly woman looked last time toward the bright blue desert sky, silently praying for a miracle, while her grandson's labored breathing resonated like a plea in her ears. The elderly woman stood for an instant, taking Oliver's hand. Her legs trembled, yes, but her spirit strengthened. She couldn't allow the criminals to harm her grandson. With a determined gesture, she headed down a narrow path between bushes and more rock formations. The terrain became increasingly rough. Oliver stumbled, but quickly got back up. Max and Luna led the way, determined to find an escape route. Behind them, the truck couldn't advance with the same ease on that narrow path. Insults and metallic blows could be heard, a sign that the pursuers were furious. It seemed like a race against time. If they reached the main road, they would have a chance of finding help. But amid the adrenaline, Grace understood something crucial. There was no way to flee permanently. Sooner or later, the criminals would find them. She wondered if it wouldn't be better to face them once and for all. She remembered the face of that scarred man. Would he be among the pursuers? While climbing a small hill, a flashback invaded her with such clarity that she almost lost her balance. It was the memory of a night when she saw that man cold-bloodedly murder a witness who refused to cooperate. She felt indescribable panic and ran away. Hours later, she declared everything to the authorities, which sealed her destiny and her family's. "Grandma!" Oliver shouted upon seeing her almost fall. He managed to grab her arm. Grace's gaze was lost for a second. Finally, she reacted. "I'm sorry. I'm still here. Just remember to stay by my side." The elderly woman's determination solidified. She wouldn't allow herself to die without first ensuring Oliver was safe. They continued advancing farther and farther from the route, hoping to confuse their pursuers. It was useless. The truck appeared again, this time from another flank of the terrain. In the distance, one of the men aimed his weapon. A second shot was heard. The bullet hit a rock just meters from Luna, making the dog jump in fright. Oliver stifled a scream, covering his head with his hands. Grace looked at Max and knew she couldn't just stand there watching. They had to continue. They undertook a desperate flight toward a more open area. Suddenly, a mechanical roar thundered through the air. The truck navigated around some rocks and stopped just meters away. Two men got out, one tall and burly with tattoos on his arms, and another with a penetrating gaze wearing a dark hat that partially covered his face. The one, in the dark, hat smiled sideways as if enjoying the terror he generated. "Meddling old woman, we have you," he said with a perverse tone. Grace felt her heart contract. She recognized even after years the malice in his voice. Oliver clung to his grandmother, and Max bared his fangs, growling ferociously. Luna was beside him, more fearful but equally loyal. "Don't make me hurt, that boy," the man added, pointing the weapon. Those words ignited rage within Grace. She felt a primitive desire to defend Oliver at all costs. The bitter memories of her daughter's death resurfaced, giving her impulse not to let fear dominate her. In an almost suicidal act, Grace stepped forward, trying to draw the criminal's attention. Meanwhile, Oliver slipped away towards some bushes, at his grandmother's covert signal. Max and Luna followed him, protecting him. The two men noticed the movement, but the burly one ran after the boy, while the one with the hat kept Grace in sight. "Oliver, run!" Grace shouted with all her strength, seeing the tattooed man disappear behind the rocks pursuing her grandson. "You stay still," the one with the hat muttered. Without thinking twice, Grace pushed a loose rock that rolled downhill, raising dust and momentarily distracting the enemy. The elderly woman took advantage to start running, her heart pounding against her ribs. She knew she couldn't compete with the speed of an armed man, but she tried. The shot sounded, and a bullet whistled, grazing her shoulder. The pain made her stumble. She got up with a groan of agony as blood flowed. With blurred vision, she advanced toward a path that led to an old abandoned bridge over the Santa Cruz River. The rusted metal structure rose solitary. Below ran a turbid and violent current, fed by underground streams. Oliver, guided by Max and Luna, was also heading to that place without knowing his grandmother was advancing in the same direction. Twisted fate had drawn a line at that bridge. Grace arrived first, breathing with difficulty. Her shoulder burned and she could barely move her left arm. She observed the bridge with desperation. The metal creaked and seemed to have points where rust threatened to collapse. There was no turning back. She advanced a few steps. Suddenly she heard Oliver's voice calling her. She saw him appear behind some bushes with Max and Luna by his side. The boy, with tears in his eyes, ran to hug her, staining his clothes with the blood flowing from the wound. "Grandma, are you okay?" he asked, seized by panic. "Not exactly, but I'm alive," she answered with a thread of voice. The dogs remained on guard. Luna licked Grace's wound as if wanting to relieve it somehow. Max fixed his attention on the other end of the bridge, from where the motor's roar and echo of threatening voices could be heard. The bridge creaked when both approached the center. A sound of loose chains and brittle planks made Grace's heart contract. Even so, she had to cross to put distance between them and the criminals. She took Oliver's hand, and they took one step, then another. The wind whispered around, mixing the smell of rust with the adrenaline of pursuit. Suddenly, a ramshackle jeep emerged from the thicket. In it came the burly man with another accomplice, and further back, the one with the hat stayed at the wheel of the black truck. The scene was painted an alarming red while the sun descended, tinting the sky with twilight fire. Without escape, Grace and Oliver were trapped in the middle of the bridge. On one side, the jeep blocked the exit. On the other, the black truck. The man with the hat got out, pointing the weapon directly at Grace's chest. The burly one did the same with Oliver. Max and Luna growled furiously, aware of the danger. "It's over, treacherous witch," spat the one with the hat. "You thought you could hide your whole life, eh? You and your family." Grace looked at him with disdain, still fighting against the burning of her wound. Oliver clung to her, his heart hammering. The burly man let out a mocking laugh. It would be so easy to shoot them and throw their bodies in the river. That way no one would find them. The elderly woman trembled with fury and fear. She looked at Oliver, who watched her with tears. She remembered the promise she made to herself to protect him at all costs. Something inside her exploded. "If you want to kill me, do it. But let the boy go," she demanded with courage she didn't think she had. A tense silence extended. The men looked at each other, hesitating. The one with the hat seemed to enjoy the scene. "Do you think we're saints? This isn't about mercy, but settling scores." Oliver, terrified, noticed the bridge railing was about to give way. A large part of the metal was fractured. Max, as if perceiving the bad intentions, jumped forward, attacking the burly man who was pointing his weapon at the boy. They became entangled in a struggle. The guy let out a cry of surprise. Luna didn't stay behind and charged at the legs of the one, holding the weapon against Grace. He lost his balance, firing into the air. The bullet resonated, piercing part of the metal structure. Oliver screamed upon seeing the weapon fall to the ground. Max managed to bite the burly man's hand, who screamed in pain, dropping his own pistol, which ended up under the planks. Grace, taking advantage of the confusion, tried to push the one with the hat, receiving in return an elbow that made her step back with a whimper. The elderly woman was at the limit of her strength. The man with the hat managed to break free from Luna, throwing her aside. He aimed a knife directly at Oliver with a merciless look. The boy held his breath, feeling trapped. It was then that Max's fury was reborn. He jumped on the attacker, seeking to bite his arm. The fight became a chaotic dance of growls and struggles. The burly man, with his bloody hand, crawled across the bridge, trying to recover his weapon. Oliver saw the pistol. Too close. A tremor invaded him at the thought of touching it, but he also understood that if that man took it first, it would be his end. Gathering courage, the boy lunged and kicked the weapon away, preventing it from falling into enemy hands. His breathing was agitated, and he felt his legs on the verge of collapse. The one with the hat pushed Max forcefully against the railing, which creaked ominously. The dog was left hanging, gripping with his paws while the structure threatened to break. Grace screamed with her soul. Oliver ran toward the dog, trying to pull him up. Luna, stunned by the blow, got up with unsteady steps, ready to help. It was then that the burly man got up with a macabre grimace. He approached Oliver from behind, ready to grab him by the neck. Grace, panting, threw an improvised blow with a loose metal bar she found nearby. She hit the criminal's knee, making him scream and collapse. But the one with the hat, despite Max's bites, remained standing with the knife in hand. "Did you really think you would escape, Grace Henderson?" he spat with rage. "If you only understood that I did what I had to do," she replied between sobs, feeling how fear and courage mixed. The railing gave way partially. Max almost precipitated into the void along with some rusted beams. Oliver couldn't allow it. He ignored the danger and leaned over the edge, gripping a piece of metal to hold the dog with his other hand. His fingers slipped from the blood and sweat, but he gritted his teeth, determined not to let go. The one with the hat advanced toward Oliver with the knife raised. Grace lifted the metal bar in a desperate attempt to defend her grandson. However, the criminal was stronger and faster. With a slash, he disarmed her. When the blade was about to cut the elderly woman's throat, Luna pounced with surprising courage, biting the man's arm. A piercing scream flooded the air while the knife crashed against the planks. It was the moment Grace needed to give a push with all her strength, launching the enemy against the damaged railing. The man lost his balance, slipping on the beams. Oliver, seeing the scene, felt his heart paralyze. A crash marked the partial collapse of the structure. The man with the hat precipitated down one side, hitting against the lower platform. He didn't fall into the river, but was left hanging from an insecure edge, screaming full of terror. While this occurred, the burly man managed to recover the knife his companion had dropped. He got up with a gesture of fury and desperation. He raised his arm to attack Oliver, but at that precise instant, Max, already rescued by the boy, turned and pounced on the criminal, pushing him against the bridge beam with such force that both lost their balance. The dog let go in time, but the man fell into the river with a hollow scream, sinking into the turbulent waters. It wasn't clear if he would survive or not. Sirens tore through the evening silence. Patrols arrived at the half-collapsed bridge, surrounded the area, and subdued the man with the hat while his accomplice disappeared in the river. Exhausted, Grace and Oliver raised their arms. Max and Luna, restless but loyal, stayed close. With the danger controlled, the elderly woman confessed her past as a protected witness of a cartel and explained the lies she wove to save her grandson. Oliver, through tears, forgave her and demanded absolute honesty going forward. After being treated in Tucson, the news of the hero dog spread. Max and Luna were adopted, becoming an inseparable part of the family. Grace had to testify again, now without fear, while Oliver matured by understanding his grandmother's sacrifice. With the gang dismantled and the truth finally exposed, both began a life without secrets, dedicated to honoring the memory of their loved ones and spreading a message of courage, loyalty, and second chances.